All right, welcome everyone to the FASEB webinar, getting ready for Capitol Hill Day at home and in DC. We still got a few more people joining us, so we're going to get a little bit of a late start today and apologize for that. So if you hang on for 1 second, we'll let a few more people join us and then we'll dive right into the agenda today. Okay, seems like we've got a live audience here, so thanks everyone for joining us. I want to extend a special welcome. This is a little bit of an unusual webinar for FASEB because we have two different types of participants. We've got some folks who are going to be traveling to Washington, D.C. next week to join us live and in person for our Capitol Hill Day. And we also have a number of folks who are going to be replicating what we do here in Washington next week at home in their own backyards by meeting with their members of Congress locally. So the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to cover a couple key things, do some welcome and housekeeping, talk about the goals of the FASEB Capitol Hill Day, same goals whether you're here with us in DC or doing this at home, how to prepare and what to expect as you get ready, what we'll be asking Congress to do when we're on Capitol Hill, and we'll finish up with some tips and ideas about how you can replicate the experience at home that our folks will be having in DC next week. And we promise, as we do with all FASEB webinars, that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, which brings me to the very important part about questions. In order to minimize feedback and interruptions and disturbances on the call, we're going to have to ask that everybody submit their questions in writing. We have not enabled the audio feature of this webinar. That being said, we will not grade on punctuation or spelling, so you can type up your question in the box here, click the gray send button, and those will roll in during the course of the webinar, and we'll get to all of them at the end. So you can type and send in a question at any time, or you can wait until the end of the webinar. It is your choice. My name is Jennifer Zeitzer, and I'm the Director of Legislative Relations here at FASEB, and I am joined by Benjamin Krinsky, who is our Senior Legislative Affairs Officer, and Kimberly Faison, who is helping us with our webinar and is also a critical part of the Public Affairs Office here at FASEB. So FASEB is a federation of 30 different scientific societies. We represent collectively over 125,000 members of the research community. And a key part of our mission is our advocacy program. And I would say that the Capitol Hill Day is probably the signature event each year for our advocacy program. But lately and more, we've been trying to get some activity going on at home in congressional districts and states to make sure that our message is really getting across to elected officials. This slide shows the logos of some of our members, of all of our member societies. So a special thank you to those folks on this webinar who are a member of one of our societies. And if you haven't thought about this, please go ahead and look into joining a society. They offer many benefits for the research community, not the least of which is participation in FASEB's activities. So FASEB really has both short-term and long-term goals when it comes to our advocacy program. And we have both because really advocacy tends to be a long game at the end of the day. It's tough to get something done on Capitol Hill in a short period of time. So the work that we do usually shows benefits and bears fruit after a certain amount of time. So in the short term, and really what we're hoping to accomplish on March 8th, our Capitol Hill Day, is to let our elected officials know about the importance of biological and biomedical research that's happening in their states and districts. We're still running into some level where members of Congress don't understand that the money that goes towards NIH and the National Science Foundation and the other agencies really does trickle back to states and districts locally. It does not stay here in Washington. We also want to ask members of Congress to support budgets that include robust increases in funding for these scientific agencies. And I'll talk a little bit later about where we are in the budget process because things are a little confusing right now. As usual, Congress was late in passing the current year's budget. So folks who come to our Capitol Hill Day next week are really going to be talking about two different budget years. Over the longer term, and this is where we're going to see a lot more come out of this, the outcomes, are developing working relationships with our senators and representatives. This is not something you can do in one 15-minute visit or a 30-minute visit, but takes time and really occurs over many months and years. And we want to help them understand the broad importance of biomedical science to our nation and to their own constituents, because this funding that goes for NIH and NSF really does benefit everyone broadly. So for those of you who are getting ready to travel to Washington next week to join us on Capitol Hill, we thank you for taking time out of your schedules for doing that. But you can do things now to prepare, and I also want to reassure you that we will have a lot of materials for you when you arrive in Washington. One thing you can do, especially if you're short on time, is visiting your senator's or representative's website or Twitter feeds. Kind of check in and review their recent activity. See what they're tweeting about, look at their press releases, look for their latest constituent newsletter and read the articles there. Those things will give you a hint about what is on their mind right now, what are their priorities. If you don't see anything about funding for science or the research agencies, that tells you that when you go see that member of Congress or their staff, you may have to do a little bit more talking to help bring them up to speed. And in terms of what you're going to be saying, again, don't worry, we will have talking points for those coming to FASEB Capitol Hill Day, and in fact also have talking points online for anyone who will be meeting locally. Not only do we have those talking points, but we have assembled, thanks to our talented team here, very important data that talks about how much federal funding is going back to states and districts in the form of NIH and NSF grants, and grants also from the Department of Agriculture. So you will have that material in your hand for Capitol Hill Day. This material is also available and will be available on FASEB's website, and we'll talk later about how you find that. In addition to those things above, now's a good time to start thinking about what you might bring with you to share from your institution or your society or your research lab. Things that are good to bring are short, colorful, so brochures, infographics, press releases. I assure you that if you bring a copy of a research article that was in a prestigious journal, probably the folks you're meeting with won't have time to read that. So something that's shorter is better. If you have an annual report from your research institution that talks about the research taking place there and the number of people that your lab or your institution employs, go ahead and bring that as well too. We recommend that if you can bring 6 to 8 copies of all materials, that will be great, because they'll be enough for all the meetings that you're going to be going to on March 8th. And then one thing you can do personally, especially if you've never done a Capitol Hill visit, prepare some bullet points really describing your own research. And this can be a challenge because you want these bullet points to be easily understandable by someone who does not have a science background. More likely than not, you will be meeting with people on Capitol Hill who don't have a strong science background. So if you can begin to think about how the research that you're doing that is federally funded improves health or benefits specific patients or diseases, produces new knowledge and innovations, that's a great time to think about what kind of basic research is your lab working on that is funded by NIH that wouldn't necessarily be funded by a private entity or perhaps a drug company. And then anything that you have about the jobs that are supported. And on that argument, it's not necessarily the numbers that are most impressive, but if you can talk a little bit about perhaps what your research lab looks like, how many people work in the lab, how many people help support that lab, and what are those types of jobs. So if you can have those bullet points ready with you before you arrive in Washington, you will be well prepared for your meetings. And then last but not least, on the prep front, business cards. Capitol Hill is one of those strange places that still trades in and uses business cards as a weird form of currency. So if you have some that have been sitting in your drawer, now's a good time to dig them out. If you don't have them and have a chance to go to Kinko's or get some printed quickly before you leave, that's a good idea as well too. What to expect during the Capitol Hill Day. Do want to warn folks who are joining us in Washington that, again, we're bringing you to Washington at one of the busiest times of the year. This is done on purpose, in part because Congress is really working on both the 2018 and 2019 budgets. So it's a really critical time to have the ear of members of Congress. That being said, you're likely to encounter some of the things you may have seen last year if you were here for Capitol Hill Day. Long lines getting into the office buildings, very crowded hallways and cafeterias, but we know you're pros and you will get through it. But to ensure that you have the best experience possible, we want to go over a couple things. So first and foremost, if you're joining us in Washington, you will have a personal guide to take you and your group around. That guide will make sure you get to all of your meetings on time, get some lunch, and take bio breaks as necessary, but you will not have to worry about finding your way around Capitol Hill. We are working diligently to finalize everyone's meeting schedules, and you will have an appointment with each congressional office. That being said, congressional offices sometimes operate like doctor's offices, and you may be kept waiting for a little bit, even if you show up directly on time. Please be patient. Your guide will sort of establish things, and we'll make sure that if you're kept waiting, that the office knows you're there. If you are kept waiting, that's a good time to turn off your cell phone. Nothing ruins a meeting more than someone's cell phone going off in the middle of it. Because it's going to be such a busy time, we are already being warned by a lot of offices that most meetings will last 15 to 20 minutes, so you'll have to get in there and quickly get to your message. Why are you there? But before you do that, be sure to introduce all the participants who are in the meeting with you. A name and institution or society is more than sufficient. Now's not a good time to go through your entire CV. Once you get through the introductions and some pleasantries, please dive right into the talking points and the messages that FASEB is giving you. We were going to ask you to focus really on two main things. The first is to quickly explain why federal funding for NIH and NSF and the other agencies really matters to that particular congressional district or state. You can use the data that we will have in your packets for you. But this is also a great time to share a personal story. You can talk a little bit about the latest with your research that you're excited about, or perhaps even why you got into the research field in the first place. We'll also ask to describe how your institution or FASEB can be of assistance, and that is something that you can easily say in the course of the meeting. We don't have a lot of time today, but we wanted to let you know that when we walk out of here, we're still a resource for you and for the congressman or for the senator. We want to help out, and we'll make sure you have our contact information, and you can call us at any time. You may be asked a question for which you don't know the answer. That's not a problem. The best thing you can do if you get a question and you're not sure of the answer, or you want to look it up, is say, I'm not sure, but I will get back to you with the answer. The worst thing you can do is guess or provide data from, sort of the top of your head that might not be correct. Because we have seen this many times where in a meeting someone provides information, the aide writes it down and then never corrects it later. So it is much better to say, I'm not sure, we'll get back to you. And the aides and people you're meeting with totally expect that. For the FASEB Capitol Hill Day, we will have a folder that you will give to every member of Congress that you meet with. And that will have all the state and district data in there, some fact sheets and talking points and a lot of other things. So you don't have to worry about bringing any of that with you. And then before you walk out of the office, it's really important to do the exchange of information. So be sure to get the business card of the person that you're talking to. And again, leave your business card if you can. So we've tried to set up a little bit of what to expect for some of these meetings, but I will say that the best way, or the most important thing you can do during your meeting is remember what our asks are. You will confuse the person you're talking to from the congressional office if you don't ask them to do something. That's why this meeting has been set up in the first place. They're expecting to have you ask them to do something. So our first ask for this year, because Congress is as usual late in finishing the budget. So fiscal year 2018 actually began last October, and the government has been funded through a series of temporary budget agreements, the latest of which will expire at the end of March. But we've got good news, because a couple weeks ago, the House and Senate and the President agreed to revise budget with increased spending, and we're now at this part of the process where the appropriations committees are writing all of the individual bills and deciding how much funding goes to each federal agency and program. So we want to encourage them when we're in DC on March 8th to finish the fiscal year 2018 budget by March 23rd, before the next temporary budget expires. We're asking for at least a $2 billion increase for NIH. That is what the Senate Appropriations Committee recommended last year in a bill that unfortunately didn't go anywhere. We're asking that they provide at least a $530 million increase for NSF or the National Science Foundation. Don't worry about writing these numbers down, because you will have them in your packet. If there's time in your meetings, fiscal year 2019 begins on October 1 of 2018. And believe it or not, Congress will be turning to the 2019 budget as soon as they finish the 2018 budget, in part because the White House submitted the president's 2019 budget request on February 12th. So the offices that you're meeting with, while they may be very focused on 2018, may also ask you, well, what is FASEB's request for NIH in 2019? And our request is at least $38.2 billion. This assumes that we get the $2 billion increase for NIH in 2018, but it's the next step in stabilizing the NIH budget. For NSF, we're asking for at least $8 billion. NSF has not had any kind of a significant funding increase in about 15 years. So we do have a very bold and aggressive ask for NSF this year. When you present these asks, you may get some responses, and hopefully you will, whether you're meeting with your member of Congress personally or one of their aides. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Ben Krinsky, to join me a little bit. We'll do a little bit of role play here. Some of these, you may hear some of these responses when you're in your meetings next week. And I say that because Ben and I have been on Capitol Hill ourselves the last couple of weeks, and these are things we've heard when we've made these same requests or similar requests to congressional offices. So one thing you may hear, particularly from a member of Congress who may be not as up to speed on where the budget process stands, they're like, wait a second, Congress passed that budget cap deal a couple weeks ago, and we took care of NIH because there was $1 billion in that budget deal for NIH. So I don't understand what you're asking me. Ben?
So this is again, gets into some of the confusion around the budget process, which is complicated, and we don't need to go into great detail. But if you get a response like this, the thing to say is that we are very grateful that a deal was reached to raise the discretionary spending caps. What that deal did was it allowed for more money, made more money available, so to speak, for these various programs, including the science funding agencies. But for that money to actually be put to use, for that money to go out the door and to use for research, education, and so forth, Congress still has to finish the budget process. In other words, the appropriators still have to pass appropriations bills, or what we think will be a single large appropriations package to actually spend the money. So it's a sort of a two-part answer. One, we are grateful that Congress did reach an agreement to raise those spending caps, and we're now asking Congress to actually finish the budget, finish those appropriations so that the money can be put to good use to support science. Just to go back and forth a little bit here, another thing you might hear from a member of Congress or their staff, something along the lines of, government can't do everything. We need the drug companies to fund more research. Jennifer, what might you say to that?
If I got that response in one of my meetings, I think what I would say is this. I understand where you're coming from on that, Congressman, and in fact, the drug companies are a very critical part of the research enterprise and community. But, you know, we're all working together. Drug companies aren't going to be able to develop the new cancer drug without the basic fundamental research that is supported by the National Institutes of Health. And as a cancer biologist, one of the things that we're working on in my lab is trying to understand how cancer metastasizes and what problems happen in cells of cancers. And hopefully one day we'll be able to take that information and create a new drug to treat breast cancer or prostate cancer. But none of the work that I'm doing that is funded by NIH is really of great interest to the pharmaceutical companies because there's no profit in it for them. We really need to understand the basics of research before we can take it to the next step of clinical applications or drug development. So the drug companies are a really important part of this enterprise, but we all really need to be working together. I'll flip the lid on Ben a little bit. Ben, you know, I'm a huge supporter of NIH funding, know how important it is to my state, but I have to tell you, I'm very concerned. NIH really just needs to prioritize the resources it already has to fund the most promising research. I really don't understand how we can be spending more than $30 billion a year and you guys still need more money?
So that's a really, it's actually a very good question. And there's sort of another, at least probably two or more part answer to it. The first is, and not to be glib, but in fact the NIH does a really good job of prioritizing its resources to fund the most promising research. NIH has very rigorous processes for reviewing grant applications, for ensuring that the best science gets funded, and in fact, that's sort of the entire mission of the NIH is to be a good steward of taxpayer dollars to make sure that good science is being funded that will lead to these transformative discoveries that in turn lead to new therapies and new cures for disease. With regard to sort of, you might say, the sticker shock part of this question, the thing to say is, well, yes, we certainly we understand the NIH is a very large agency, and we are extremely grateful for the budget increases that NIH has received over the past few years. But biomedical research is fundamentally a very expensive thing. The rate of inflation for the cost of research is very high, and despite the fact that NIH has received these budget increases over the past couple of years, we're still actually well below the purchasing power that NIH had 10 or 15 years ago. So we're still actually, despite the fact that it's a $34 billion agency, we're still looking to sort of rebuild the capacity for biomedical research that has really made our country a leader in these areas of science. Okay, so Jennifer, here's one we might hear. Representative X would support increasing the NIH budget if he had a chance to vote on that by itself.
We totally understand where Representative is on this issue. You know, again, we're at a situation where members of Congress in a couple weeks are going to be presented with a giant bill that includes, $1 trillion plus in funding for all government agencies and programs. And buried in there, we hope will be a $2 billion increase for NIH. We're frustrated. We understand that puts you in a tough position, Congressman, to have to vote for that when we know you support NIH, but there might be other things in there that maybe you don't support. But unfortunately, we can't control that process. So what we're asking for is when you do see that omnibus appropriations bill in a couple of weeks, we ask you to think carefully and critically about everything that's included in there and to really vote yes on that bill because it does include the funding for NIH. And we recognize again that there may be things in there that you don't support. We wish this were a different way. We wish that, every year that when it came to funding NIH, Congress could just take a yes or no vote because we're pretty confident that thing would pass like 400 to nothing in the House. But that's not a process that we as advocates can control. Ben, I'm glad you came and visited me today. It's great to see you. Hope everything is going well in Connecticut. But I gotta tell you, NIH is a bipartisan priority. I don't even know why you guys are here.
Well, again, we really appreciate the bipartisan support that NIH received. We know how important it is to so many members of Congress and to all of your constituents. But again, we also understand that there are many different political priorities in Washington. We know this is an extremely busy time. So while we are, of course, very grateful for your support, we're here to remind you about how critical it is to make these investments in research, and that we want to make sure that the increases we've enjoyed in the past couple of years are not perhaps a one or just perhaps two-hit wonder. That we want to see robust, sustained, predictable increases in funding for biomedical research because it is so critical to generating that next generation of therapies and cures.
Well, the good news is you guys have nothing to worry about. We're going to take care of NIH. I promise you that.
If only all of our meetings ended on such a happy note. I hope they do.
Well, speaking of meetings ending on a happy note, you may encounter a situation where you walk into an office, maybe you know ahead of time, or maybe you saw a tweet that indicates that perhaps the senator you're going to see is not very supportive of funding research or funding these big government bills. So you may get this one. Senator Smith has never voted for an omnibus spending bill. We just want to make sure you understand that he's not going to be voting for this one either.
So I think the answer to this one is similar to one Jennifer gave a few moments ago. So we appreciate that, Senator. We know that we would love for Congress to return to so-called regular order to pass separate appropriations bills for each of the sets of programs and go through the process as it was constitutionally intended. However, the political circumstances have led to this point for an omnibus spending bill. And while, again, there may be lots of things in this large piece of legislation that you don't agree with, we really do hope that you support it because it does fund critical programs like the NIH and the NSF.
So these are just some things you may encounter in your meeting. Ben and I do our best to anticipate what might happen on Capitol Hill Day. That being said, we can't really anticipate everything. So like the manual that maybe came with your computer or your cell phone, we did want to make sure that we give you some ideas about how to troubleshoot some problems you may encounter. So let's say you go through your speech and your talking points and you stop to catch a breath and you realize that the person you're meeting with is just giving you a blank stare and may or may not be all there. So what do you do then if that happens when you get that blank stare from the person you're talking to?
I think there's a couple things to do. One is to, if you're talking about something else, for example, some details of the research that you do, one thing we always advise is to pivot back to the main asks for these meetings, that is to increase funding for the NIH, the NSF, and the other funding agencies. Again, I think at some point, just have to resort to sort of basic sort of etiquette and human pleasantries. If it seems like the meeting has essentially reached an end, then you can bring it to a polite end. Say, thank you so much for meeting with us. We hope that the congressman or senator will support funding for biomedical science.
Well, we mentioned that we have taken care of making appointments for you. What we can't guarantee is where that meeting will take place. So Capitol Hill offices are notoriously very small and crowded, so it's entirely possible that the person you have a meeting with comes to greet you and says, I apologize, but we're going to have to take this out in the hallway. All of our conference rooms are booked, and there isn't a single free chair in the office. If that happens, just roll with it. Follow the person out to the hallway. I will say one tip, the hallways on Capitol Hill are marble and sound carries terribly. So if you're having difficulty hearing, it is perfectly acceptable to say to the person that you're speaking with, don't mind meeting in the hallway, but could we take it down the hall or go around the corner to someplace that's slightly more quieter? I'm having a tough time hearing while people are stomping by here. So you can certainly, if you have to meet in the hallway, ask to move it a few feet or to someplace slightly quieter. We told you to turn off your cell phone so that you don't get distracted, but we can't control what the person you're meeting with is doing. So you may encounter a situation where the aide is maybe listening to you, but also very engaged with his or her cell phone. If that happens, try and again, roll with it. You can do your best to engage that person and say, do you have any questions, or, could I interest you in more information about the cancer research that's taking place at my institution? But do your best to engage the person who's checking their phone, and then we'll talk a little bit afterwards about how to do some additional follow-up. And we'll apologize in advance if you do encounter that. Hopefully you will not, but that happens from time to time. It may become obvious during the course of your conversation that the person you're speaking with doesn't really know anything about NIH and may not even know what NIH stands for. If that is the case, you can take a little bit of time to talk about the basics of what NIH does and the research that it funds. But we did try and make appointments as much as possible with the people for whom NIH is their area, their portfolio. You may get this one because this happened to me not that long ago. I was meeting with a person who said, I've been here 2 days, so I haven't had a chance to get fully briefed on the congressman's position on NIH funding. If that happens, you can say, we totally understand. We'd like to, however, follow up with you next week to continue this conversation and learn a little bit more about your boss's position on this issue. So don't be too alarmed if the person that you're meeting with doesn't really know where his or her boss is. And then this happens from time to time. Someone brings up an unrelated issue that has nothing to do with NIH funding, whether it's you or the aide that you're meeting with. And a typical scenario is the aide you're meeting with, we have a great conversation, and it says, oh, by the way, I have a question for you guys. How do you feel, what's FASEB's position on House Bill 1744? And you have no idea what House Bill 1744 is. Again, don't worry about it. What you can say in that case is, well, that's not a topic of discussion that we were ready to do today, but would it be okay if we had someone from FASEB follow up with you in the next 24 hours to discuss this issue further? Or maybe it's an area of research that you don't necessarily know much about or are not an expert, but you could also offer one of your colleagues and you can say, oh, as a matter of fact, there's an oncology research center on our campus. I'd be happy to connect you with one of my colleagues who's more of an expert on that issue. So if someone does bring up an unrelated issue, do your best to sort of roll with it. And again, it is very acceptable to say, well, really, we have limited time here today. We wanted to talk about funding, but we would be happy to schedule a follow-up phone call with you if you want to discuss issue X a little bit further. So the last part for folks who are coming to our Capitol Hill Day next week, very important, is the follow-up. Because you're going to have such short meetings, follow-up is how you continue that relationship. First and foremost, we believe here in FASEB in being polite and sending thank you notes. Email is best. all mail going into members of Congress and their staff goes through a complicated screening process off-site, so it's delayed by 6 to 8 weeks, and when it arrives, sometimes is basically crumbled and can't be read. So we will provide everyone with email addresses for the staff aides you met with. They should be on their business cards as well, too. We'll also provide some suggested language so that you don't necessarily have to craft these things yourself. The thank you email is also really important for sending your contact information, particularly if you don't have a business card. And finally, the follow-up email can also accomplish two other really, really important things. The first is if you promise to send any follow-up information as a result of your meeting, you can include that in the thank you email. Couple pro tips that we've discovered over the years ourselves. Links to online documents work best for two reasons. One, congressional staff email, they have very, very aggressive spam filters. Attachments oftentimes make the email get rejected by their system. In addition, most congressional staff have very strict size limits on their email boxes. So if you send a large PDF or file, that might get rejected as well, too. So anytime you can send a link or a URL, that's a better way to include follow-up information. In addition, if the staff person or member of Congress that you met with has an outstanding request that they owe you or information they owe you, you can remind them about that in this thank you email. And then last but not least, report any questions or concerns from your meetings directly to the FASEB staff. If you're not sure if it's something to be concerned about, err on the side of just letting me or Ben know, and we will be happy to follow up with that office. So I want to step back a little bit and bring my colleague Ben back up here. Ben's going to give some tips and advice for folks who can't join us in Washington next week, but want to do and repeat this exercise back home. So Ben?
Great, thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer has said, even if you will not be joining us next week for FASEB Hill Day, there are other ways to engage with your elected officials. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how you can make arrangements to meet with your officials locally. So as you'll see on this slide, our website includes information about contacting your senators and representatives in their states and district offices. You can set up meetings with staff in local offices at any time. These offices are staffed full-time year-round. When you reach out to those offices, and I'll say more about that in a few moments, you can ask about public appearances. Members of Congress are often back in the districts or states for town hall meetings, office hours, etc. And as I said a moment ago, even though you can reach out to your local offices at any time, a good time to do so is during congressional recess. Those are times when your actual members of Congress should be back home and might be accessible. There is one of those congressional recesses coming up at the end of March 26th to April 6th. So in particular, we encourage you to reach out and try to get a meeting set up at that time, because there's actually a chance you might see your representative or senator in person. So as I said a moment ago, we have a wealth of information on our website that can help you to set up these meetings. We have what we call our Advocacy Tools website, and there's a URL listed at the top of this slide. The first thing, so to say, first things first, you might be wondering how to find your representatives or senators' local office. If you go again to this website, we have a button here called Legislative Action Center. If you click that, you should see a screen that looks something like this. And on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a little box where you can enter your zip code. When you enter your zip code, it might ask for additional information, for example, your home address. This is because congressional districts in the House sometimes split zip codes. So just put in your contact information. Because, again, the way congressional districts are drawn, we actually encourage you to try both your home address and also the address of your office or laboratory, because who knows, you may actually be able to reach out to more than one member of the House of Representatives. So after you put in your contact information, the output should look something like this. This is just an example. Representative Tom Cole, who happens to be the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee in the House that oversees the NIH budget. And as you can see, what this tool provides is actually quite a large amount of information, biographical information about your representative or senator. And the most important thing, as highlighted with the red arrow, is it gives you the location and contact information for your local district office. So this is where you can reach out by phone or via email and set up a meeting. So again, our website has a lot of information and tips and tricks about how to request and set up a meeting, including, as you'll see sort of towards the bottom of this page, sample email you can send. Feel free to use this text. And again, if you have any questions about how to do this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We also have a lot of so-called advocacy best practices. This is a lot of the information that Jennifer has already presented. The same sorts of things that go for Hill Day also go for meetings in your hometown or in your state. Again, we encourage you to make sure you bring any materials that you want to leave behind with you. This includes information about funding, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. And also, again, just as the meetings go on Capitol Hill, they go in a very similar fashion in your local office. You should introduce yourself. You say a little bit about who you are and the research that you do. And then, again, always try to focus on this very important message that Congress needs to provide robust, sustained, increased funding for biological and biomedical research. So as I said, we have a lot of information available for free on our website. We encourage you to download and bring with you to your meetings, whether you're here in Washington or back home. One of our things we're most proud of are our state and district fact sheets. These provide information about the funding from NIH, NSF, and other agencies that are going to your states and districts. If you click on the link as shown here, a map of the U.S. will pop up. If you click on your home state, that'll show you a list of all the congressional districts and also statewide data. And I said you just click that and you can download PDFs and print out and use on whichever meetings you have. We also have additional information about funding for scientific research, including trends in NIH research funding over time. Again, we encourage you to use all of these resources because we really want to provide this information to our elected representatives to show them how important this funding is, both for their local states and districts, but also for the national biomedical research enterprise. We also, as we do each year, provide funding recommendations, that is to say where we'd like the agency budgets to go in a given fiscal year. This image here is from our fiscal year 2018, the current fiscal year. We will have an updated set of funding recommendations. They will be put online in the coming days. As Jennifer said, we are quickly coming up on the process to begin the fiscal year 2019 budget. So stay tuned. We will have a brand new set of recommendations in the next week or two available online. In addition, we'll also have a set of research examples showcasing some of the cutting edge research that is being done by the members of FASEB societies. Also wanted to highlight that we have a new fact sheet specifically about the National Science Foundation. Jennifer also already mentioned this, but unlike the NIH, the NSF has not seen the kinds of robust budget increases over the last few years, and we really believe it's very important that Congress provide additional support to NSF. So we have this new fact sheet. The URL, again, is at the bottom of the page here. Please, as with the rest of our information, feel free to download it, print it out, use it in your meetings. This is a great resource, talks about the kinds of research the foundation supports and some of the key breakthroughs in the biological sciences that have been enabled by NSF funding. We also have other resources in addition to data. For example, our Breakthroughs and Horizons in Bioscience newsletters. The Breakthroughs in Bioscience series illustrates recent breakthroughs in biomedical research and their importance to society. It also highlights the important role animal models play in biomedical research and discovery. So these are really wonderful newsletters, full color presentations about cutting edge research. We really encourage you to distribute these widely. To complement them, Horizons in Bioscience describes scientific discoveries on the brink of clinical application. These are shorter one-page documents that are intended to supplement the Breakthroughs newsletters. So again, both of these are available for free to download on our website, and we also now have many of them in the form of a podcast. So if you prefer to listen to them as opposed to reading the hard copy, we encourage you to do that as well. Last but not least, we strongly encourage you to invite officials to visit your lab. So yes, please do invite members of Congress and or their staff to visit your lab. This is really a great way for them to see firsthand the important research that is happening in their district. And more importantly, to go to that point about the longer term goals of our advocacy, this helps to build personal relationships with congressional offices. And in the long run, this helps them, that is your members of Congress, to be better advocates in Washington. We've heard many stories about where a member of Congress or their staff comes, sees what's going on in a laboratory, gets really inspired, and then when they go back to Washington, they become sort of a torchbearer for basic research. It means that this issue is sort of in the forefront of their thinking, and they're going to be a much stronger advocate among their colleagues in Congress. Just want to say this last bullet point, local aides may be especially interested in the lab visits. Again, if you cannot arrange a meeting in your lab with your member of Congress or with the senator, that's okay. Showing your laboratory to the staff is also really a great opportunity, again, to build those relationships and to try and cultivate some new champions for biological research on Capitol Hill.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben. But as promised at the beginning of the webinar, we are now going to turn things over to you, the audience, and allow you to ask questions. So we'll go through all these questions, as many as we can until we get to 3 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and get started. Since folks cannot see the questions coming in, we're going to repeat them back so that everyone can benefit. So one question that came in, will this webinar be recorded? How could I share this or get a copy of this afterwards? Great question. Yes, the webinar is being recorded, and we will post it on the FASEB website in the next day or two, and we'll make sure that everybody who participated in this webinar and signed up but wasn't able to join us gets an email with the link for how to access the recording. So that's a wonderful question. Here's a good question. Is regular order really called for in the Constitution? To be honest, now you stumped the webinar organizers. It's not necessarily called for in the Constitution. The modern day budget and appropriations process actually goes back to the 1970s, unfortunately. And so there is a process that is laid out with regard to the president submitting a budget every year and Congress reviewing that budget and then putting together the 12 appropriations bills, and everything's supposed to be wrapped up by October 1. Congress has not hit that deadline in about 30 years, so there's a lot of conversation lately about how do we reform the process. Unfortunately, that's beyond FASEB's wheelhouse to fix, so we're stuck in the same loop that even members of Congress are, where every year we talk about our funding requests and Congress misses the deadline. So that is unfortunately not something required by the Constitution. For those of us coming to Capitol Hill Day next week, will we be meeting as 2 or 3 investigators going to each office? What is the process? Another great question. For most of you who are coming to Capitol Hill Day next week, you will be in a small group of people from your state or a nearby state, so that you don't have to do these meetings by yourselves. You'll be paired with another scientist. One tip that we will do is, if you wind up being with scientists from another state, let them take the lead in their meetings with their senators and representatives, and you take the lead in your meeting. But part of the reason we pair you up in states, make sure everybody has a buddy, but also to send the message that science does cross state lines and district lines and is really collaborative. So the other benefit of being with someone else in these meetings is to talk about how scientists work together and share ideas. Another question that's come in, will our folders have copies of the NSF fact sheets as well as NIH state and district fact sheets? Yes, they will. Anyone coming to Capitol Hill Day will have copies of all of those fact sheets already printed out for you in the folder that you will leave with your member of Congress. Pro tip for those of you meeting with your members of Congress at home, you can print those fact sheets from our website on your home computer and then bring them with you to the meetings locally as well too. So that's part of the reason why we provide them for free on the FASEB website. Is it a good idea to bring a single dramatic printed image from your research? I think that's a great idea. Ben, what do you think?
Yes, indeed. If there's something that you find particularly interesting or compelling that really illustrates the kind of exciting research that you're doing, please feel free to bring that. Again, a lot of the main reason it's so important to bring scientists to Washington is for you to share the perspectives that you have on the research that you're doing and why federal support for it is so important. So yes, please feel free to bring those materials with you.
My senator recently announced that he is not running for re-election. Will that have any impact on our visit next week? It should not have any impact on your visit next week. Even if your senator announced that they will not be returning to Congress next year in 2019, they still get to serve until the end of 2018, which by my calendar has about 7-8 more months left at least. So that should not impact your meeting at all next week. And in fact, some senators may say, or representatives, this is my last year to make an impact on on Capitol Hill. As a constituent, what would you suggest that I do? And then you can jump in and say, well, as a matter of fact, you could help us get another $2 billion increase for NIH in 2018 and even more money in 2019. So, but retirement should not in any way impact your visit. In the unlikely chance that we run into an AIDS and those issues, what does FASEB stand on indirect facilities and administrative costs across different universities? This could come up in your meetings. We will make sure that we go over this for our Capitol Hill Day. We'll have an additional prep session for anyone coming to Washington on this issue next week. The issue on F&A, FASEB does not necessarily have a position on that. It was a big point of contention and discussion last year on Capitol Hill because the 2018 White House budget request talked about seriously and dramatically capping those costs. The good news is the 2019 request does not include that, so we do not really expect much discussion of the facilities and administrative cost issue next week. My postdoc is funded by NIH. Can I invite him to attend the meetings with me? One thing I would say is if you're planning to come to Capitol Hill Day next week, we ask at this point that you don't bring any additional guests with you. We have a lot of work goes into the logistics of planning the Capitol Hill Day and making sure we have enough materials. In addition to the appointments we've requested in congressional offices, we've already submitted those things. So we would ask that if you're coming to join us in Washington, D.C. next week, you don't bring any guests that we don't know about. But that being said, it would be a great idea to take your NIH-funded postdoc to meetings at home locally and work with him or her to maybe put those meeting requests in and get those appointments. What is our highest priority message to deliver regarding the 2018 budget? Ben, what do you think?
I think what you should say is finish the 2018 budget. not to be glib, but it's really critical that Congress does finish the FY fiscal year 2018 budget process. Even though, as we went over earlier, there is a deal in place that raises the caps on the amount of money that can be spent, they haven't yet appropriated those funds. So the strongest message we're trying to get across is that they need to finish the FY 2018 budget, including robust increases for the NIH, the NSF, and the other agencies that fund life sciences research.
Do many representatives have science advisors? That is a wonderful question. Unfortunately, a lot of them do not. We do not have a list of which offices do and do not have advisors. One thing that we will let you know is that most of the aides that you'll be meeting with are responsible for, in some cases, a dozen or even 24 different issues. They're expected to have a lot of knowledge, and they may not, which is where you come in. So that's why you should offer to be a resource to the person that you're meeting with to say, look, we recognize that you probably have a lot of things that you're responsible for. I'm happy to serve as an informal science advisor and give you information that you might need about science. So you should always offer to be a resource in that office. It's a fair question to ask as well, too, as you're meeting with a person and say, is there a particular person in this office who's responsible for science, or would the senator or representative be interested in having a more informal science advisor? So you can make that offer. Is there a large value add to totally customizing an email as opposed to using some kind of a form language that FASEB provides? There's actually a ton of value into customizing an email. The reason FASEB provides some form emails through our electronic advocacy system is so that to get you started on writing a message to your member of Congress, to make it easier to automate it. But we really do encourage the more personal the message that you send to your member of Congress or their aides, the more likely they are not only to read it, but also to absorb it. We really do want to try and move away from some of these form letters. They're spotted easily in Capitol Hill offices. They're not taken as seriously. So if you get an opportunity and you see, let's say, a FASEB action alert, every single one of our alerts allows you to customize that message, and we really encourage you to take the time to do that if you can. Is there a scientific advisor in the White House yet? Is that a position that has been filled in the West Wing? Not to our knowledge, unfortunately. That is one of the vacant positions in the administration. And so, FASEB has sort of been keeping an eye on that. We haven't even heard any good rumors lately about who might fill that position. It's an important role that does need to be filled. Unfortunately, it's not the only administration job.
Yeah. In addition to that, the entire Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, or OSTP, generally have not been very active since the start of the Trump administration. So in addition to the lack of a permanent science advisor, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of activity lately from OSTP, but again, as Jennifer said, it's something that we monitor closely, and we await to any changes to that state of affairs.
Another question that just bounced in. It sounds like these meetings that I'm going to be doing next week on Capitol Hill will be painfully short. Do you really think 15 minutes is enough time to talk about NIH funding? Absolutely not. Unfortunately, that's all we could get. That's pretty typical for a meeting on Capitol Hill. But again, this is why it's really important to send a follow-up email after your meeting to try and engage the person that you're talking to in a longer conversation, perhaps even set up a phone call, or to recommend requesting a meeting at home to spend some more time. Anecdotally, what we've learned from FASEB board members who've done this the last 2 summer recesses is not only are they more likely to see the member of Congress personally during a meeting at home, they're getting more time, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. We actually had one meeting last year where our folks got an hour with their member of Congress, totally uninterrupted. So the 15 minutes, the real goal of our meetings next week is to sort of establish that relationship, check in, make sure we still have their support for funding, and then use it as a way to trigger follow-up afterwards.
So another question just came in. Will FASEB be providing voting records for senators, representatives that we are meeting with on Capitol Hill Day? The answer is yes, we will. In all of your folders, we will have bio sheets, so sheets with biographical information about your senators and representatives, and included with that will be information about the way in which they've voted, as well as the kind of dear colleague letters and things that they've signed on to sort of give us a sense of where they stand on funding for basic research.
Is Twitter really a good way to learn about your senator's position on an issue? I heard that most of the tweets are written by their staff and sometimes may not even accurately reflect the boss's views. Unfortunately, that does happen. Twitter is not the best way. It is one way to learn more about your senator or representative. So we encourage you to take a look at their website as well too. Looking at the press page of their website, their news releases, their opinion columns, they're in the news section is one way to learn a little bit more information about who these people are and what they believe and what their top priorities are. So Twitter is just one tool. Many members of Congress do rely on their staff to send their tweets for them. There are a couple who are notorious for writing their own tweets. Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa is probably one of the most famous tweeters on Capitol Hill, as is Senator McCaskill from Missouri.
Okay, another question just came in. You recommended that we prepare bullet points about our research. Is this something we should print out and bring with us to DC? I think if this is the first time you're coming to FASEB Capitol Hill Day, that might be helpful to write out some notes for yourself just to remind you what you'd like to say. And again, we want to stress these meetings generally are very short. You may only have 15 to 20 minutes, and it's important to come back to the main asks, which are to raise the budgets for NIH and NSF in finishing the fiscal year 2018 budget. That said, if you feel more comfortable speaking sort of extemporaneously about your research and why it's important, you should do whatever you feel most comfortable doing. But it is something we really value, having scientists come to Washington to talk about the research that you're doing in the most straightforward way that you think you can.
This is obviously from someone who's been there Capitol Hill Day before. I came to Washington last year and wound up having some really great meetings with several aides who were very knowledgeable about NIH. But what can I say this year so I don't sound like a broken record? It's a wonderful question. If that is the situation you find yourself in, especially when the aide says, I know exactly why you're here, we are 100% on board, then take the time to give the person you're talking to some information that they couldn't find from Google. So for example, talk a little bit about perhaps a research grant that maybe you just submitted and are waiting to hear back from, or talk about an exciting area of research in your field that might benefit from an additional infusion of federal dollars, but for which we really can't do much right now because of lack of funding. Or talk a little bit about what's going on in your own lab, the new postdocs that you're hoping to bring on. But give them information that they couldn't necessarily get from reading a news article or doing a Google search. That's one way you can sound not like a broken record and make that visit meaningful and worthwhile.
Okay, another logistical question here. You said to bring business cards, but my institution doesn't provide them, and I don't think I'll be able to order anything online before I come to DC. How important are business cards? It's a good question. So, like we said, the DC business and political world still deals in business cards. It's an interesting quirk of Washington. So I would say, if possible, and if it's not terribly onerous, it would be very good to make and bring business cards, if at all possible. That said, it is not going to end the meeting or do anything disastrous if you don't have business cards. And because you're going to be meeting with a group of other scientists, there will no doubt, and also have an escort, there will no doubt be someone with whom to exchange, who can exchange business cards with the congressional staffer. So again, if you really can't bring business cards, don't worry too much about it. And there are certainly other ways in which you can provide your contact information to the staffers you'll be meeting with.
The 2017 state and local research funding data is great, but I'm more interested in 2018 data. When will we have that? As a matter of fact, the 2017 data actually is the most current data available. I think, as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, because Congress has not even completed the 2018 budget process yet, most or all federal agencies have just finished closing out their 2017 spending. So that's why we're asking, or we have the 2017 funding data right now. That being said, the 2018 data should be available this time next year, and FASEB will go ahead and post that online as well too. So don't be concerned that you're walking into a congressional office with 2017 data. That really is the latest data available from the agencies.
Okay, here's a question not about Hill Day, but again about local outreach. Do you know how long meetings usually last in local offices? And following up with that, do you get more time with members of Congress if you meet with them at home versus in Washington? I would say the answer to this perhaps varies. Staff in local offices, and particularly members of Congress themselves, are still very busy, so they probably won't be able to give you hours of their time. That said, because you are a constituent coming to a local office, things may be a little bit less hectic back home than they are in Washington. So indeed, you may get a little bit more time, in which case you can talk perhaps a little bit more in depth about your research, talk a little bit in more detail about how science funding benefits the district or the state. But again, to reiterate, these of course are busy people working on many different things. So it's important to try and be pithy and emphasize this point about the importance of increasing the research budgets for NIH, NSF, and the other agencies.
So we're coming up on the hour, but we have time for one or two more questions, and we do have a few more. So let me scan these quickly. Here's one I'm glad somebody asked. Should I get permission from my supervisor or others at my institution before I invite my members of Congress to visit my lab? Yeah, that's a good idea. We don't want anyone to get in trouble at home for doing this. So please check with your department heads and your internal guidelines to find out what the protocol or process is for inviting a member of Congress to visit your lab. One thing that you can do is talk to the people in charge, particularly in your government affairs office, and even suggest that and say, we're doing some really exciting things here in the oncology lab. We would love to have Senator Smith come join us. Could you help us arrange a visit? So it is a good idea to check with folks higher up in your institution before you issue a blanket invitation to a member of Congress to come visit your lab. That being said, staff is a little bit different, and you probably have more freedom to invite the local staff. So it's 3 o'clock. We will end with one more question before we close out in order to respect everybody's time. Again, from the local side, can I call a local office of my representative or senator to request a meeting? Do I really have to submit a request in writing? Another one where it varies greatly. Unfortunately, we have not been able to collect information to say which offices you can call and which offices you should write. So I think the best thing you can do is use the FASEB tool on the website to kind of get the local office information. Make a phone call first, and you can say, I'd like to make an appointment, I'm a constituent, and find out what the process is. In addition, you can look at their websites, and many members of Congress now have a button or a tab on their website that says request a meeting, and you click on that, and that provides instructions. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for all of your advocacy, those of you who are coming next week in DC, and those of you that we've inspired to repeat this process at home. I want to let folks know that if there's anything else that we can do for you, the way to contact us, the FASEB Office Public Affairs website is right there. We also have an email box. And again, everyone who participated in this webinar will get access to the recording, which will be on the FASEB website. So thanks again, and have a good afternoon.